In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, a wealthy widow, Mrs. Eleanor Carstairs, plummets from her window at Willow House. Was it an accident or murder? Miss Jane Marple, with her keen eye and knitting needles, unravels a web of secrets. A nurse hiding deadly negligence, a son drowning in debt, a doctor with a failing practice, and a timid maid who knows too much. A scuffed sill, a lost earring, and a torn log led to a shocking confession, proving no secret escapes Miss Marple's gaze. In this gripping tale of betrayal and justice. Chapter 1. The Fall at Willow House. The late September light cast long shadows over St. Mary Mead, where the village stirred with a rare agitation. Miss Jane Marple sat by her parlor window, her knitting needles clicking with a rhythm as steady as the ticking of the mantel clock. The autumn air carried the scent of damp leaves, but it was the sharp voice of her maid, Lily, that broke the quiet. "It's dreadful, miss," Lily said, bustling in with a tray of tea and scones. Mrs. Carstairs pushed clean out her window at Willow House last night. The milkman saw her body this morning, lying by the roses. Miss Marple's needles paused, her mild blue eyes sharpening behind her spectacles. "Pushed, you say?" Her voice was gentle, but there was a note in it that made Lily flush. "Well, that's what they're whispering," Lily amended. "The police call it an accident. Fell from her bedroom window, they say." Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her mind already turning over the word pushed. In her experience, village whispers often held a thread of truth, however tangled. Mrs. Eleanor Carstairs, the widow of a prosperous merchant, was a figure of quiet renown in St. Mary Mead. Her wealth was evident in the upkeep of Willow House, a handsome Georgian manor with ivy-draped walls and windows that caught the sun like polished mirrors. At 72, she was frail but formidable, her sharp tongue and sharper mind undimmed by age. Miss Marple had met her at church bazaar, noting her brisk manner and the way her eyes assessed people as if weighing their worth. An accident seemed unlikely for such a cautious woman. The vicar, Mr. Clement, arrived shortly after tea, his face creased with concern. "Jane," he said, settling into an armchair, "the village is in a state. The police are at Willow House. But I fear they're too quick to call it a mishap. Would you discreetly, of course, lend your insight?" Miss Marple's reputation for unraveling human nature was a quiet legend in St. Mary Mead, and the vicar knew better than to underestimate her. She agreed with a nod, folding her knitting into its basket. "I'll take a walk to Willow House," she said, her tone as light as if she were planning to admire the gardens. The path to Willow House wound past hedgerows and the village green, where knots of villagers murmured. Miss Marple, in her sensible tweed coat and felt hat, greeted them with her usual courtesy, gleaning fragments of gossip. Mrs. Carstairs had been found at 9 the previous evening, her body crumpled on the stone path beneath her bedroom window. Her silk shawl, a gift from her late husband, was caught in the thorns of a rosebush. "Such a pity," said Mrs. Bantry from the post office, "but she was old, wasn't she? Easy to lose her balance." Miss Marple smiled politely, noting the assumption. Old age, she thought, was too often a convenient excuse. Willow House stood at the edge of the village, its wrought-iron gates gleaming in the fading light. Inspector Harrow, a stocky man with a bristling mustache, met her at the door. His greeting was polite but edged with impatience. He had little time for elderly spinsters, however sharp their minds. "Miss Marple," he said, "the vicar speaks highly of you. But this is a straightforward case." Mrs. Carstairs leaned too far out her window and fell. No signs of foul play. He led her to the garden, where the stone path bore faint chalk marks outlining where the body had lain. Miss Marple's eyes traced the scene. The rose bushes, slightly trampled. The path swept clean but for a faint smear of mud. And the window above, its white frame stark against the ivy. "The bedroom, Inspector?" she asked, her voice mild. Harrow led her upstairs, his boots heavy on the polished oak. The room was airy, with chintz curtains and a four-poster bed, its quilt undisturbed. The window, low and wide, invited a view of the garden. Miss Marple leaned forward, her gloved hand brushing the sill. A faint scuff mark marred the wood, and in the curtain's hem a single pearl earring gleamed. "Curious," she murmured, her fingers lingering on the fabric. "Mrs. Carstairs was not wearing earrings when found, I presume?" Harrow blinked, caught off guard. "No, she wasn't. How did you?" But Miss Marple only smiled, her mind cataloguing the detail. She noted the room's tidiness, no overturned chairs, no scattered papers, but tidiness, she knew, could conceal as much as it revealed. Over tea in the drawing room, Harrow outlined the household. Mrs. Carstairs had lived with 4 others. Clara Henshaw, her nurse, a woman of stern efficiency. Lionel Carstairs, her son, a charming but wayward man. Dr. Morris Godwin, her physician, who visited regularly. And Violet Marsh, the young maid, timid and deferential. All claimed to have been elsewhere in the house at the time of the fall. "We're questioning them," Harrow said, "but it's clear enough. An old woman, a dizzy spell, a low window." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression placid. "People," she said softly, "are rarely where they say they are, Inspector." Her eyes, bright and unyielding, met his, and for a moment Harrow felt the weight of her scrutiny. She rose, thanking him for his time, and stepped into the garden, where the roses seemed to whisper secrets of their own. As she walked back to her cottage, her mind wove the threads together. The scuff, the earring, the too tidy room. Accidents, she thought, were often the masks of darker deeds. Mrs. Carstairs was restless, Clara said, her voice steady but her fingers tightening. She often was at night. "I thought the laudanum would help." Miss Marple's needles clicked as she listened, noting the faint tremor in Clara's hands. "And the window?" she asked. "Was it open when you left her?" Clara hesitated. "I don't recall. She liked fresh air, even in autumn." Miss Marple smiled, but her eyes were sharp. A nurse who didn't recall a window state was either careless or evasive. Harrow dismissed Clara and called for Lionel Carstairs. The son entered with a practiced charm, his lean frame clad in a tailored suit that spoke of expense. His hair was slicked back, his smile easy, but Miss Marple caught the faint scent of cigar smoke and the nervous tap of his foot. "I was in the library," he said, echoing Clara's precision. "Mother was fine at dinner. I heard nothing until Violet screamed." His eyes flicked to the window, then away, as if avoiding the garden beyond. Miss Marple asked, gently, "Did your mother often stand by that window?" Lionel blinked, caught off guard. "Not really. She was careful, always fussing about drafts." His voice was smooth, but there was a crack in it, like ice under pressure. Miss Marple nodded, her needles moving steadily. Lionel's debts, whispered about in the village, were a heavy shadow. A man in debt could be desperate, and desperation, she knew, could lead to dark acts. Dr. Morris Godwin was next, a silver-haired man with a polished air that bordered on arrogance. He confirmed his visit at 7, prescribing a stronger dose of digitalis for Mrs. Carstairs' heart. "She was stable," he said, his voice clipped. "I left by 8, well before any trouble." Miss Marple noted his manicured hands and the faint stain of ink on his cuff, suggesting late-night bookkeeping. A struggling practice, perhaps reliant on wealthy patients like Mrs. Carstairs. Finally, Violet Marsh, the maid, crept in her eyes. Wide and nervous. She was barely 20, her hands twisting in her apron. "I was in the pantry, polishing silver," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I heard a scream and ran out. That's when I saw her." Tears welled, but Miss Marple saw something else, fear, not just of death, but of someone in the room. "You're very diligent, Violet," she said kindly. "Did you notice the Window earlier. Violet shook her head, her cheeks flushing. No, miss. I don't go in there much. Nurse Clara handles the bedroom. Harrow dismissed Violet and turned to Miss Marple. Well, satisfied, it's an accident. She folded her knitting, her expression serene. The scene is never the whole story, Inspector. A scuff on a sill, an earring in a curtain, a smear of mud. These are threads, and threads lead to patterns. Harrow sighed, but his skepticism wavered. You see too much, Miss Marple, he said, almost grudgingly, as she left Willow House. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the garden in shadow. Miss Marple paused by the rose bushes, her eyes on the window above. The house was silent, but its secrets were not. She thought of St. Mary Mead's quiet scandals, a maid who stole to feed a family, a son who gambled away his future, a doctor who cut corners. Each could be a thread, and Mrs. Carstairs' fall was no accident. People, she murmured, weave their own traps. With a final glance at the window, she walked back to the village, her mind already untangling the knot of Willow House. Chapter 2. The scene of the crime. Miss Jane Marple stepped carefully through the wrought iron gates of Willow House, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel path. The autumn sun hung low, gilding the ivy that clung to the manor's stone facade, and a faint breeze stirred the air, carrying the scent of roses and something sharper, perhaps the lingering unease of tragedy. She had come at Inspector Harrow's reluctant invitation, his gruff voice still echoing in her mind. No harm in you looking, Miss Marple, but it's a clear case. Old lady, low window, bad luck. Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint, private smile. Luck, she knew, was a poor substitute for truth, and her years in St. Mary Mead had taught her to trust neither appearances nor hasty conclusions. The manor stood imposing yet serene, its tall windows reflecting the fading light, like watchful eyes. Willow House was the sort of place that commanded respect, its Georgian elegance softened by well-tended gardens and a certain lived-in warmth. Mrs. Eleanor Carstairs had maintained it meticulously, her wealth evident in the polished brass of the door-knocker and the pristine flower-beds. Yet, as Miss Marple approached, she sensed a discord beneath the order, a house that held secrets as tightly as it held its grandeur. Inspector Harrow awaited her at the front door, his broad shoulders filling the frame. His mustache twitched with impatience, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of curiosity as he greeted her. Miss Marple, he said, his tone a mix of courtesy and skepticism. I've got my men combing the grounds, but there's little to see. The coroner's leaning toward accidental death. You'll find the same, I expect. He gestured toward the garden, where a constable stood by a chalk outline on the stone path, the spot where Mrs. Carstairs had been found the previous evening. Miss Marple adjusted her felt hat and followed, her steps deliberate. The path wound through rose bushes, their blooms heavy with late-season color. Though one bush bore signs of disturbance, petals scattered, thorns snagged with a shred of silk. Her shawl, Harrow noted, pointing, caught there when she fell, must have been wearing it. Miss Marple bent closer, her gloved fingers brushing the fabric. It was fine silk, pale blue, the kind a woman like Mrs. Carstairs would cherish. A gift, perhaps? She asked, her voice mild. Harrow shrugged. Her son said it was from her late husband. Sentimental, I suppose. She straightened, her eyes lingering on the path. The stones were swept clean, but a faint smear of mud caught her attention, barely visible in the shadow of the roses. It was fresh, not yet baked dry by the sun, and shaped like the edge of a heel. Curious, she murmured, filing the detail away. She turned her gaze upward to the window above, its white frame stark against the ivy-covered wall. The bedroom was on the second floor, the window low and wide, its sill no more than 2 feet from the floor, a dangerous design for a frail woman, or a convenient one for darker purposes. Shall we go up? Harrow asked, already moving toward the house. Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning over the scene below. The garden was too orderly, the path too clean, as if someone had taken care to erase their presence. She followed Harrow through the oak-paneled hall, its walls adorned with portraits of stern-faced Carstairs ancestors. The air inside was cool, scented with beeswax and lavender, but there was a stillness that felt oppressive, as if the house itself mourned its mistress. The staircase creaked under Harrow's boots, but Miss Marple ascended lightly, her hand trailing the polished banister at the top. A corridor stretched left and right, lined with closed doors. Harrow led her to the second door on the left, pushing it open to reveal Mrs. Carstairs' bedroom. It was a spacious room, its chintz curtains drawn back to let in the light. A four-poster bed dominated the space, its quilt smooth and undisturbed, as if no one had slept in it. A mahogany dressing table held a silver hairbrush and a small vase of fresh roses, their scent mingling with the faint tang of medicinal alcohol. Harrow gestured to the window. There's where she went out. No sign of a struggle, no broken glass, just an open window and a bad fall. Miss Marple crossed the room, her eyes scanning every detail. The floor was polished oak, its surface unmarred except for a faint scuff on the sill, a shallow crescent of abrasion that suggested something or someone had pressed against it with force. She leaned forward, her fingers brushing the wood, and noticed a single pearl earring caught in the hem of the curtain. It was delicate, its luster dulled by a speck of dust, and it seemed out of place in the otherwise pristine room. An earring, she said softly, holding it up to the light. Was Mrs. Carstairs wearing earrings when she was found? Harrow frowned, caught off guard. No, she wasn't. Just the shawl and her nightdress. Where'd you find that? Miss Marple pointed to the curtain, her expression serene but her mind racing. It was tangled here. Odd, don't you think, for it to be left behind? Harrow grunted, scribbling a note. Could have been there for days. Maids miss things. Miss Marple's lips twitched, but she said nothing. Maids, in her experience, rarely missed anything, though they often saw more than they admitted. She examined the window more closely, noting its ease of movement, no sticking hinges, no rusted latch. It opened outward with a gentle push, offering a clear view of the garden below. A woman leaning out might lose her balance, but Mrs. Carstairs was not the leaning sort. She was cautious, precise, the kind who checked her locks twice and never left valuables unattended. The room itself offered little else. A bedside table held a glass of water, half empty, and a small bottle of laudanum, its label smudged, but legible. A leather-bound book of poetry lay beside it, a ribbon marking a page. Miss Marple opened it, noting the underlined verse, "The life so short, the craft so long to learn." She closed the book gently, her thoughts drifting to Mrs. Carstairs' character. A woman who underlined poetry was not one to stumble carelessly out a window. Harrow shifted impatiently. Seen enough. I've got statements to take. The households waiting downstairs. Miss Marple nodded, but her eyes lingered on the dressing table. A small jewelry box sat open, its contents neatly arranged: brooches, a gold locket, a pair of sapphire rings, but no matching pearl earring. One moment, she said, opening a drawer. Inside were linens, a sachet of lavender, and a folded letter, its seal broken. She left it untouched, but its presence nagged at her. Letters, like earrings, could tell stories. Downstairs, Harrow outlined the household's accounts of the evening. Mrs. Carstairs had dined at 7, attended by her nurse, Clara Henshaw, who administered her evening medication. Her son, Lionel Carstairs, claimed to have been in the library, reading. Dr. Morris Godwin, who had visited at 7 to check her heart condition, left by 8. Violet Marsh, the maid, was polishing silver in the pantry. All agreed the house was quiet until a scream at 9, when Violet found the body and raised the alarm. Consistent stories, Harrow said. No one saw anything unusual. Miss Marple settled into a plush armchair in the drawing room, her knitting bag at her side. Consistency, she said, her voice soft, is sometimes a sign of rehearsal. Harrow raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. He summoned Clara Henshaw first, and Miss Marple observed the nurse as she entered. Clara was a sturdy woman of 40, her dark hair pinned tightly, her uniform crisp, but her eyes wary. She sat stiffly, her hands clasped in her lap, and recounted her evening. She had left Mrs. Carstairs at 8:30 to fetch laudanum from the kitchen, returning only after the scream. Chapter 3. The Nurse's Tale. Miss Jane Marple sat in the drawing room of Willow House, her knitting needles moving with a quiet rhythm that belied the sharpness of her gaze. The room was elegant, its walls adorned with faded tapestries and a portrait of Mrs. Eleanor Carstairs in her youth, her eyes bright with the confidence of a woman who knew her own mind. The late morning light filtered through tall windows, casting a soft glow on the polished furniture, but the air held a tension that no amount of polish could dispel. Inspector Harrow had arranged for the household to be questioned again, and Miss Marple, at his grudging invitation, was present to observe. "Just don't stir them up too much," he'd muttered, but she had only smiled, her needles clicking like Ametronome. Clara Henshaw, the nurse, was the first to be called. She entered with the brisk efficiency of a woman accustomed to command, her dark hair pinned tightly beneath a starched cap. At 40, she was sturdy, her frame suggesting strength rather than grace, and her face, though not unkind, was set in lines of determination. She sat opposite Miss Marple and Harrow, her hands folded in her lap, though Miss Marple noted the faint tightening of her fingers when Harrow began his questions. "Miss Henshaw," Harrow said, his voice gruff but measured, "let's go over it again. You were with Mrs. Carstairs last evening. What exactly happened?" Clara's eyes met his steadily, but there was a flicker in them, a shadow that Miss Marple caught like a snag in her knitting. "I've told you, Inspector," Clara said. "I was with Mrs. Carstairs until 8:30. She was restless, as she often was after dinner. I gave her the usual dose of digitalis for her heart, then went to the kitchen to fetch her laudanum. She liked a few drops to help her sleep." Miss Marple's needles paused, her head tilted slightly. "And how was Mrs. Carstairs when you left her?" she asked, her voice as gentle as a summer breeze. Clara turned, her expression guarded. "As I said, restless. She was sitting in her chair by the window, looking out at the garden. She often did that in the evenings." Miss Marple nodded, but her mind lingered on the word restless. A restless woman might pace or fidget, but would she stand by an open window, risking a chill? Mrs. Carstairs, from what Miss Marple had gleaned, was fastidious about her health. Harrow pressed on. "You didn't hear anything unusual? No cries, no sounds of a struggle?" Clara shook her head, her lips thinning. "Nothing. The house was quiet. I was in the kitchen when Violet screamed. I ran out and saw her." Her voice faltered, and she looked down, her hands clenching briefly. Miss Marple noted the tremor, slight but unmistakable. Grief, perhaps, or something else. Guilt, fear, or the strain of a lie. "Miss Henshaw," Miss Marple said, her tone still mild, "you must have been very devoted to Mrs. Carstairs. Nursing is such a demanding role, and she relied on you greatly." Clara's eyes softened, but only for a moment. She was a good mistress, though sharp at times. I did my best to keep her comfortable." Miss Marple smiled, her needles resuming their rhythm. "Of course. And her medication digitalis, you said. It requires such precision. You kept a log, I presume?" Clara nodded, a touch too quickly. "Yes, I always did. It's in the study, if you need to see it." Harrow made a note, but Miss Marple's mind was already turning. She recalled a conversation with Mrs. Bantry at the church bazaar, who had mentioned Clara's dedication, but also her occasional sharpness when Mrs. Carstairs questioned her methods. A nurse's devotion could be a virtue, but it could also mask resentment, especially if her competence was challenged. Miss Marple thought of old Mrs. Pritchard in St. Mary Mead, whose nurse had been fiercely protective till a will was changed, and loyalty turned to spite. Harrow dismissed Clara, and Miss Marple requested to see the medical log. Harrow sent a constable to fetch it, and soon a leather-bound notebook was placed before them. Miss Marple opened it, her eyes scanning the neat rows of entries, dates, times, doses of digitalis and laudanum, all recorded in Clara's precise hand. But as she turned the pages, she noticed irregularities, dates skipped, entries smudged, and one page torn at the edge, as if ripped out in haste. "How curious," she said softly, her fingers tracing the jagged tear. "A nurse so meticulous, yet this log is incomplete." Harrow frowned, leaning over. "Could be an accident. Pages tear." Miss Marple's smile was polite, but unconvinced. "Perhaps. But a nurse's log is her defense, Inspector. To damage it suggests carelessness or something to hide." She closed the book, her mind cataloging the detail. Clara's hands, strong and capable, could administer medicine with precision, but they could also push a frail woman with ease. And the tremor in her voice, the guarded eyes, Miss Marple had seen such signs before. In a village girl who'd stolen to cover a debt, her fear betrayed by the smallest gestures. As Harrow prepared to call the next suspect, Miss Marple, thoughts drifted to the window in Mrs. Carstairs' bedroom. The scuff on the sill, the pearl earring in the curtain, they were like misstitched rows in her knitting, small errors that hinted at a larger flaw. She recalled the smear of mud in the garden too, and wondered if Clara's sturdy shoes might match its shape. Nurses, she knew, were often in and out of houses, their movements unnoticed. Had Clara been in the garden that evening, perhaps before or after her trip to the kitchen? Harrow's voice broke her reverie. "Miss Marple, shall we see the sun next?" She nodded, tucking her knitting into its bag. "Yes, Inspector. But might I suggest we ask Miss Henshaw to show us her shoes? The garden path was muddy, and I'd be curious to see if she walked there last night." Harrow's mustache twitched, but he agreed, sending for Clara again. When Clara returned, her face was composed, but her eyes darted to Miss Marple, as if sensing a trap. "My shoes," she said, her voice tight. "I don't see why that matters." Harrow, at Miss Marple's nod, insisted, and Clara reluctantly removed her sturdy black shoes. Miss Marple examined them, noting a faint trace of dried mud on the heel, its texture matching the smear on the path. "Interesting," she said, handing them back. "You must have been in the garden recently, Miss Henshaw." Clara flushed. I check the herbs sometimes, for Mrs. Carstairs' tea." Miss Marple smiled, her expression serene. "Of course, how thoughtful." But as Clara left, her steps quicker than before, Miss Marple's mind turned over the lie. Herbs were grown in the kitchen garden, not near the roses where Mrs. Carstairs had fallen. Clara's presence there suggested more than a nurse's errand. Miss Marple thought of a case in St. Mary Mead, where a gardener's muddy boots had betrayed his theft from a shed. Small details, she knew, could unravel grand deceptions. Harrow, watching her, sighed. "You see mysteries in everything, don't you?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Only where they exist, Inspector, and they so often do." She settled back, her knitting resumed, but her thoughts were far from idle. Clara Henshaw's tale was plausible, her devotion convincing, but the torn log, the muddy shoe, and the guarded eyes told a different story. Negligence, Miss Marple mused, could be a motive as strong as greed or fear, especially for a nurse whose livelihood depended on trust. As Harrow called for Lionel Carstairs, Miss Marple's needles clicked on, weaving a pattern only she could yet see. Chapter 4. The son's motives. Miss Jane Marple sat in the drawing-room of Willow House, her knitting needles moving with their usual quiet precision, a soft counterpoint to the tension that hung in the air. The room, with its high ceilings and heavy velvet drapes, seemed to absorb sound, making every word spoken feel weightier, as if the walls themselves were listening. Inspector Harrow stood by the fireplace, his broad hands clasped behind his back, his eyes fixed on the door as he awaited the next suspect. Miss Marple, though, was observing the portrait above the mantel of younger Mrs. Carstairs, her gaze imperious yet touched with a hint of melancholy. It was a reminder, Miss Marple thought, that even the wealthiest lives carried their burdens. Lionel Carstairs entered with a stride that was almost too confident, his lean frame clad in a suit of fine wool, the cut just a shade too fashionable. For St. Mary Mead, at 35, he had the charm of a man accustomed to winning favor, his dark hair slicked back, his smile quick and disarming. But Miss Marple noted the details that betrayed him, the faint redness in his eyes, the nervous tap of his polished shoe, and the scent of cigar smoke that clung to him like a confession of late nights and reckless habits. He settled into a chair, crossing one leg over the other, and met Harrow's gaze with an ease that felt practiced. "Mr. Carstairs," Harrow began, his voice gruff, "we're piecing together the evening of your mother's death. You said you were in the library at the time of her fall. Can you walk us through it?" Lionel's smile flickered, but he nodded. "Of course, Inspector. I dined with Mother at 7. She was in good spirits, though tired. After dinner, I went to the library to read. I was there until Violet's scream at 9. I ran out and saw, well, you know what I saw." His voice caught, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the way his fingers tightened on the armrest, as if anchoring himself against scrutiny. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she spoke, her tone gentle but probing. "You must have been very close to your mother, Mr. Siston Carstairs, living here at Willow House. Did you often spend evenings together?" Lionel's smile returned, but it was strained. "Not always. Mother liked her routine dinner, then her room with Clara. I kept to myself, mostly reading, you know." He gestured vaguely, and Miss Marple noted the expensive cufflinks glinting at his wrists, their gold out of place in a village where simplicity was the norm. "Reading," she repeated, her voice as soft as a whisper. "What book, may I ask? You must have a fine library here." Lionel blinked, caught off guard. "Oh, some novel. Dickens, I think. Great Expectations." Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. Dickens was a safe choice, but the library, she recalled from her earlier glance, was lined with leather-bound classics, their spines pristine, as if rarely touched. A man who read Dickens would have a favorite passage, perhaps, but Lionel offered none. Harrow leaned forward, his mustache twitching. "And you heard nothing? No cry, no sound from your mother's room?" Lionel shook his head. "Nothing. The library's at the other end of the house. I only heard Violet when she screamed." His eyes flicked to the window, then back. "And miss, can you complete the chapter?" Marple caught the movement, a fleeting sign of unease. The library, she thought, was indeed distant from the bedroom, but Willow House was not so large that a scream would go unnoticed. And Lionel's manner charming, yes, but to polish reminded her of young Tommy Blake in St. Mary Mead, whose easy smiles hid a penchant for gambling and lies. "Mr. Carstairs," Miss Marple said, her needles pausing, "your mother was a cautious woman, I understand. Did she ever express concerns about her safety here?" Lionel's smile faltered, and he shifted in his seat. "Not really. She was particular, always locking her jewelry away, checking the windows, but she never said she was afraid." His voice was steady, but Miss Marple noted the way his fingers brushed the cufflinks, as if reassuring himself of their presence. She recalled village gossip, whispered over tea at Mrs. Bantry's, about Lionel's debts and London debts that Mrs. Carstairs had refused to settle, insisting he reform. Harrow produced a notebook, flipping to a page. "We've heard your mother's will leaves most of her estate to you, provided you clear your debts. That's a strong motive, wouldn't you say?" Lionel's face darkened, but his tone remained light. "Motive? For what? I loved my mother, Inspector. And I didn't need her money. I've business prospects in town." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Prospects, she knew, were often a gambler's euphemism for hope, and hope was a fragile thing when creditors came calling. She thought of the pearl earring in the curtain, the scuff on the windowsill, and the smear of mud in the garden. Lionel's shoes, polished to a mirror shine, showed no trace of mud, but his nervous energy suggested a man with secrets. "You must miss her terribly," she said, her voice kind but her gaze unwavering. "It's hard to lose a parent, especially when you're so dependent on their support." Lionel's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Yes, it's shock." Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her mind turning over the threads of Lionel's story. The will was a crucial detail, and she made a mental note to speak to the solicitor, Mr. Pettigrew, who handled Mrs. Carstairs' affairs. A son stood to gain much from a mother's death, but only if the timing was right. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a young man had forged checks in his father's name, his desperation masked by charm until a ledger betrayed him. Lionel's cufflinks, she thought, were like those check symbols of a life he could not afford. Harrow asked a few more questions, but Lionel's answers remained smooth, almost rehearsed. As he rose to leave, Miss Marple spoke again. "One last thing, Mr. Carstairs. Did your mother ever wear pearl earrings?" Lionel paused, his hand on the door. "Earrings sometimes, I suppose." "Why?" Miss Marple smiled, folding her knitting. "Just a thought. Thank you." He left, his footsteps echoing in the hall, and Harrow turned to her, exasperated. "What's this about earrings again?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Small things, Inspector, often tell large stories. A man like Lionel Carstairs lives beyond his means, and that makes him vulnerable to temptation, to pressure, perhaps to worse." She thought of the earring left behind in haste, and wondered if Lionel had been in his mother's room, arguing over money or pleading for forgiveness. The library, she decided, warranted a visit. Harrow grunted, but he agreed to let her see it. The library was a handsome room, its shelves lined with books that looked more decorative than read. A leather armchair sat by a cold fireplace, a single book on the table beside it, not Dickens, but a racing almanac, its pages dog. Miss Marple's lips pursed. "Not great expectations," she murmured, her fingers brushing the cover. A man who lied about his reading might lie about his whereabouts. And Lionel's charm, she suspected, was a mask for something darker. They returned to the drawing room. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the household's dynamics. Clara's guarded demeanor, Lionel's evasions, each was a thread in a tapestry that was not yet clear. The will, the debts, the earring, these were pieces of a puzzle. And she knew from experience that motives were often buried in the mundane. "A son," she said softly to Harrow, "is a powerful force in a mother's life, for good or ill. We must learn more about Mr. Carstairs' prospects." Harrow sighed, but his tone was less dismissive. "You're building a case out of nothing, Miss Marple. But I'll have my men check his finances. Anything else?" She smiled, her needles clicking once more. "The library, Inspector. It's a fine place to claim you were, but a poor one to prove it." As Harrow called for the next suspect, Miss Marple's mind wove the threads together, her instincts whispering that Lionel Carstairs' motives were as tangled as the ivy on Willow House's walls. Chapter 5. The doctor's diagnosis. Miss Jane Marple sat in the drawing room of Willow House, her knitting needles clicking softly, a steady rhythm that seemed to anchor the room's uneasy atmosphere. The late morning light slanted through the tall windows, catching the dust motes that danced in the air and illuminating the portrait of Mrs. Eleanor Carstairs, whose painted eyes seemed to follow every movement. Inspector Harrow stood by the mahogany sideboard, his broad frame restless as he prepared to question the next member of the household. Miss Marple, though, was already sifting through the threads of the case de scuff on the windowsill, the pearl earring in the curtain, the smear of mud in the garden niche, a clue that pointed to something more deliberate than an accident. Dr. Morris Godwin entered with the air of a man accustomed to respect, his silver hair neatly combed, his tailored coat immaculate despite the early hour. At 50 he carried himself with a polished confidence, his voice smooth and measured. But Miss Marple noted the faint lines of strain around his eyes and the ink-stained cuff of his shirt, a small sign of carelessness in an otherwise meticulous appearance. He took a seat, crossing his legs with an ease that suggested he was more at home in a surgery than a drawing-room under scrutiny. Double quotes, Dr. Godwin, Harrow began, his tone brisk. You visited Mrs. Carstairs on the evening of her death. Tell us exactly what happened. Godwin inclined his head, his expression composed. I called at 7, as I often did. Mrs. Carstairs had been complaining of palpitations, and I examined her to assess her heart condition. She was frail but stable, and I prescribed an adjustment to her digitalis dose to manage her symptoms. I left by 8, well before any incident. His voice was calm, but Miss Marple caught the slight hesitation before incident, as if the word had been chosen with care. Her needles paused as she spoke, her voice gentle but precise. You must have known Mrs. Carstairs well, Dr. Godwin. Attending her so regularly. Was she concerned about her health? Godwin's eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw a flicker of wariness. She was cautious, naturally. A woman of her age, with a weak heart, would be, but she trusted my judgment. Miss Marple smiled, her gaze steady. And the digitalis you increased the dose that evening. It's such a delicate medicine. I understand. Godwin nodded, his fingers brushing the ink stain on his cuff. Yes, a slight increase. Her condition warranted it. I noted it in my records. Harrow flipped open his notebook. We'll need to see those records, Doctor. Any chance the dose could have caused dizziness, made her unsteady? Godwin's lips tightened, but he shook his head. Highly unlikely. The adjustment was minor, and I've prescribed it for years without issue. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, but her mind was elsewhere. Recalling a case in St. Mary Mead where a chemist's error with digitalis had led to a patient's collapse. A doctor's mistake, she knew, could be as deadly as intent. And Godwin's polished demeanor suggested a man who guarded his reputation fiercely. Dr. Godwin, she said, her tone as mild as ever, did you notice anything unusual during your visit? Mrs. Carstairs' mood, perhaps, or anything in her room? Godwin paused, his fingers stilling on his cuff. She was a bit sharp, perhaps. Complained about the cost of my visits, which was unlike her, but nothing else stood out. Her room was, as it always was, quiet. Miss Marple nodded, but her thoughts lingered on the complaint about cost. Mrs. Carstairs, village gossip suggested, had been a generous but discerning patron, and a doctor reliant on her payments might feel the sting of her scrutiny. Harrow pressed on. You left at 8. You say anyone see you go? Godwin's eyes narrowed slightly. The maid, Violet, was in the hall. She can confirm it. Miss Marple made a mental note to ask Violet about this, for maids often saw more than they were credited for. She thought of the pearl earring, caught in the curtain's hem, and wondered if it had been dislodged during a heated exchange. Mrs. Carstairs' sharpness, as Godwin described, might have been more than a passing mood, perhaps a confrontation. Overtreatment or fees. Harrow sent a constable to retrieve Godwin's medical records, and soon a slim ledger was brought to the drawing-room. Miss Marple opened it, her eyes scanning the entries. The records were meticulous, detailing visits, symptoms, and prescriptions. But she noticed discrepancies: dates where digitalis was prescribed but not delivered, and others where the dosage seemed unusually high for a woman of Mrs. Carstairs' frailty. Curious, she murmured, her fingers tracing a smudged entry. Some of these prescriptions were not filled. Dr. Godwin, was Mrs. Carstairs aware of this? Godwin's face remained impassive, but his voice grew cooler. She was forgetful at times. I relied on Clara to manage the doses, and she was competent. Miss Marple's smile was serene, but her mind was sharp. Competence, she knew, could be a mask for error, and a struggling doctor might have reasons to obscure his mistakes. She recalled village whispers about Godwin's practice, which had dwindled in recent years, his wealthier patients turning to a younger physician in the next town. Mrs. Carstairs' payments, she suspected, were a lifeline he could ill afford to lose. Harrow closed the ledger with a snap. "We'll have this checked by a chemist," he said. "If there's anything off, we'll find it." Godwin nodded, but Miss Marple caught the faint tightening of his jaw, a sign of a man under pressure. She thought of the scuff on the windowsill, the kind that might come from a struggle, and wondered if Godwin had been in the room longer than he claimed. A doctor, she mused, could know exactly how much digitalis might weaken a patient, making a push seem like a fall. As Godwin rose to leave, Miss Marple spoke again. "One last question, Doctor. Did Mrs. Carstairs ever wear pearl earrings?" Godwin's brow furrowed, but he shook his head. "Not that I recall. She preferred brooches, simpler things." He left, his footsteps measured but quick, and Harrow turned to Miss Marple, his exasperation evident. "Earrings again. You're chasing shadows, Miss Marple." She folded her knitting, her eyes bright behind her spectacles. "Shadows, Inspector, often show where the light doesn't reach. Dr. Godwin's records are not as tidy as his manner, and a man whose practice is failing has much to lose if his mistakes are exposed." She thought of a St. Mary Mead doctor, who had once overprescribed tonics to mask his own errors, only to be undone by a chemist's vigilance. Godwin's ink-stained cuff, she decided, was a small clue. But small clues often led to larger truths. Harrow sighed, but his tone held a grudging respect. "You see too much, Miss Marple. I'll have the chemist look at the digitalis doses." "Anything else?" She smiled, her needles clicking once more. "The maid, Inspector. Let's see what Violet saw when Dr. Godwin left, and perhaps a look at his accounts, if Mr. Pettigrew can oblige." As Harrow called for Violet, Miss Marple's mind wove the threads together: discrepant records, a strained doctor, a missing earring. The pattern was forming, and she knew that in Willow House the truth was as carefully hidden as the roses were carefully tended. Chapter 6. The maid's secret. Miss Jane Marple sat in the drawing-room of Willow House, her knitting needles moving with a gentle, relentless rhythm, like the ticking of a clock that measured not time but truth. The room, with its heavy drapes and polished mahogany, seemed to hold its breath, as if wary of revealing the secrets woven into its walls. The portrait of Mrs. Eleanor Carstairs gazed down, her painted expression both stern and sorrowful, a silent witness to the unfolding inquiry. Inspector Harrow paced by the window, his broad frame casting a shadow across the floor, his patience visibly thinning as the morning wore on. Miss Marple, however, was content to observe, her mild eyes missing nothing: the faint creak of a floorboard, the flicker of unease in a suspect's glance, the way the light caught the dust on a forgotten vase. Violet Marsh, the maid, was summoned next. She slipped into the room with the hesitancy of a deer stepping into an open field, her slight figure almost lost in the starched folds of her apron. At 20, she was pale and delicate, her brown eyes wide with a nervousness that seemed to quiver in the air around her. Her hands twisted together, the knuckles white. and her gaze darted between Harrow and Miss Marple, settling briefly on the floor, as if seeking refuge there. Miss Marple noted the worn heels of her shoes, their leather scuffed in a way that recalled the mark on the windowsill in Mrs. Carstairs' bedroom. A small detail, but in Miss Marple's experience, small details were the stitches that held a mystery together. "Miss Marsh," Harrow began, his voice gruff but not unkind, "you've told us you were in the pantry polishing silver when Mrs. Carstairs fell. Let's have it again, and don't leave anything out." Violet swallowed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, sir. I was in the pantry, like I said. It was just after 8:30, I think. I was working on the candlesticks Mrs. Carstairs liked them bright for dinner parties. Then I heard a scream, and I ran out to the garden. That's when I saw her, lying there by the roses. Her eyes filled with tears, and she pressed a hand to her mouth, as if to stifle a sob. Miss Marple." Needles paused, her head tilted slightly. "You poor dear," she said, her tone soft and grandmotherly. "It must have been a terrible shock, finding your mistress like that. You were fond of her, weren't you?" Violet nodded, her tears spilling over. "She was kind to me, miss. Always gave me a bit extra at Christmas, and never minded if I was slow with the dusting." Her voice trembled, but Miss Marple caught something else, a fleeting glance toward the door, as if she feared someone might enter. Harrow leaned forward, his notebook open. "You say you were in the pantry. Did you see anyone else in the house before the scream? Dr. Godwin, perhaps, leaving at 8. Violet's eyes widened, and she nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. I saw him in the hall, putting on his coat. He said good night, and left by the front door." Miss Marple's smile was gentle, but her mind was sharp. Violet's confirmation of Godwin's departure was too prompt, too precise, as if rehearsed. She thought of a St. Mary Mead girl, Polly, who had once lied to protect a sweetheart. Her words too eager to be true. "Violet," Miss Marple said, her voice as soothing as a lullaby, "you must be very observant, working in a house like this. Did you notice anything unusual that evening, perhaps, in Mrs. Carstairs' room when you tidied it earlier?" Violet's hands twisted tighter, and her cheeks flushed. I didn't go in her room that day, miss. Nurse Clara does the bedroom, mostly. I stick to the downstairs." Miss Marple nodded, but her eyes lingered on Violet's shoes, their scuffs a silent contradiction. A maid who avoided the bedroom might still venture there, especially if some coerced. Harrow's mustache twitched with impatience. "And the scream, who else came running when you found her?" Violet hesitated, her gaze dropping again. "Mr. Lionel came from the library, and Nurse Clara from the kitchen. Dr. Godwin was already gone." Her voice was steady now, but Miss Marple noted the way her fingers plucked at her apron, a nervous habit that betrayed more than her words. She recalled the smear of mud in the garden, the scuff on the sill, and now the worn heels of Violet's shoes. They were threads, delicate but insistent, pointing to a presence that Violet was reluctant to admit. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her hands folded in her lap. "Violet, you're a good girl, I can see that. But sometimes, fear makes us hold back what we know. Was there anything or anyone that made you uneasy that evening?" Violet's eyes darted to the door again, and for a moment, Miss Marple thought she might speak. But then her lips pressed tight, and she shook her head. "No, miss, nothing." The denial was too quick, and Miss Marple's heart sank, not for the lie, but for the fear behind it. She thought of Clara Henshaw's stern demeanor, the way Violet seemed to shrink in her presence. A maid under a nurse's thumb, she knew, could be persuaded to silence her worse. Harrow dismissed Violet, his frustration evident. "She's scared, but she's not saying why," he muttered, turning to Miss Marple. "You think she's hiding something?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, but her expression was grave. "Fear, Inspector, is a powerful silencer. Violet knows more than she tells, and I suspect someone in this house knows why. She thought of a St. Mary Mead incident, where a housemaid had witnessed a theft but kept silent, fearing her employer's wrath. Violet's fear, she suspected, was tied to Clara, whose authority in the household was absolute. Determined to test her theory, Miss Marple requested a moment alone with Violet, away from the drawing room's oppressive air. Harrow agreed, and they found Violet in the kitchen garden, where she was hanging linens to dry. The garden was a small, walled space, fragrant with herbs and shielded from the main house. Violet started at their approach, her hands dropping. "A damp sheet. Oh, miss," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't expect you here." Miss Marple smiled, settling on a stone bench. "I find gardens so calming, don't you? And you must spend time here, with the herbs for Mrs. Carstairs' tea." Violet nodded, but her eyes were wary. "Sometimes, Nurse Clara sends me for mint or chamomile." Miss Marple's needles resumed their work, a soothing sound in the quiet garden. "Clara must rely on you a great deal. She's a strong presence, isn't she?" Violet's hands stilled, and she looked away, her voice barely audible. "She's particular. Doesn't like mistakes." Miss Marple's tone remained gentle. "And did she ever catch you making one, Violet? Perhaps borrowing something of Mrs. Carstairs? A brooch, or maybe an earring?" Violet's face paled, and her hands clutched the sheet. "I never stole nothing, miss. I tried on a brooch once, just to see, and Clara saw. She said she'd tell Mrs. Carstairs. Get me sacked." Her voice broke, and Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes kind but unyielding. "And did she tell, or did she ask you to do something to keep her quiet?" Violet's tears spilled over, and she shook her head fiercely. "I didn't do anything, miss, I swear it." But her fear was palpable, and Miss Marple saw the truth. In her trembling hands, Clara's hold over Violet was a weapon, and a frightened maid could be coerced into complicity or silence. The scuff on the sill, Miss Marple thought, matched Violet's worn shoes, and the earring suggested a struggle, perhaps one Violet had witnessed or fled from. Returning to the drawing room, Miss Marple shared her thoughts with Harrow. "Violet is afraid, Inspector, and fear makes a poor liar. She was in that room, or near it, and Clara knows why." Harrow rubbed his chin, his skepticism softening. "You think the nurse bullied her into something? Covering up, maybe?" Miss Marple's needles clicked on. "Or standing by while something was done? Fear, Inspector, is a motive in itself." As Harrow called for the next interview, Miss Marple's mind turned to the earring, the scuff, and Violet's trembling hands, each a thread in a pattern that was growing clearer, stitch by careful stitch. Chapter 7. The Village Whispers. Miss Jane Marple walked slowly along the winding lane of St. Mary Mead, her sensible shoes tapping lightly on the cobblestones, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. The autumn afternoon was crisp, with leaves drifting in a gentle breeze, and the village hummed with its usual quiet rhythm yet beneath the surface. Miss Marple sensed the undercurrent of gossip that always followed a tragedy. Willow House and the death of Mrs. Eleanor Carstairs were the talk of every shop and garden gate, and Miss Marple knew that in St. Mary Mead whispers often carried truths that official inquiries overlooked. She had promised Inspector Harrow to return to Willow House later, but for now she sought the village's pulse, where the unguarded words of neighbors might unravel the threads of the mystery. Her first stop was the post office, where Mrs. Bantry presided behind the counter, her sharp eyes missing little. The small shop was crowded with villagers collecting letters or buying stamps, their voices low but eager. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Bantry," Miss Marple said, her smile as mild as ever. "Such a sad business at Willow House, isn't it?" Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Sad, yes, but not surprising. Jane, Mrs. Carstairs was a sharp one, always watching her household like a hawk. I heard she'd had words with that son of hers, Lionel, over his gambling. And the nurse Clara, is it? Wasn't always as patient as she seemed. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained serene. Clara Henshaw, yes, a devoted nurse, I'm told. Did anyone mention tensions? Mrs. Bantry's lips pursed. Mrs. Price at the bakery said. Clara snapped at Mrs. Carstairs once. Right in the garden, when she questioned her about some medicine. Said it was just a moment, but you know how those things linger. Miss Marple nodded, filing the detail away. A nurse's temper, she thought, could be a small crack in a carefully built facade. Much like the scuff on the windowsill that hinted at more than a fall. She moved on to the tea shop, where the air was thick with the scent of scones and the murmur of voices. Miss Hartnell, a spinster with a penchant for gossip, sat at a corner table, her knitting rivaling Miss Marple's for speed, if not precision. Jane, Miss Hartnell called, waving her over. You've been up at Willow House, haven't you? Dreadful business. I always said that Dr. Godwin was too smooth by half. My cousin's friend went to him once, and he charged a fortune for drops that did nothing. Miss Marple settled beside her, her needles emerging from her bag. Dr. Godwin does seem busy, she said, her tone inviting more. Miss Hartnell leaned closer. Busy, yes, but not thriving. They say his practice is struggling, and Mrs. Carstairs was one of his last good patients. She didn't always trust him, mind you. Mrs. Weatherby heard her say his bills were outrageous, and she was thinking of switching to young Dr. Haydock in the next town. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, but her mind was alert. A doctor with a failing practice, she knew, might take risks to keep a wealthy patient or to hide a mistake. She thought of the smudged entries in Godwin's records, the discrepancies in the digitalis doses, and wondered if Mrs. Carstairs' doubts had pushed him to desperation. As she sipped her tea, Miss Marple steered the conversation to Violet Marsh. The maid seemed such a timid girl, she said. I wonder how she fared in that grand house. Miss Hartnell's eyes narrowed. Timid, yes, and under Clara's thumb, Mrs. Price saw Violet crying in the lane once, after Clara scolded her for breaking a cup. Poor thing looked terrified. Mind you, Violet's sweet, but she's not one to stand up for herself. Miss Marple nodded, recalling Violet's trembling hands and the fear in her eyes when Clara's name was mentioned. A maid's loyalty, she thought, could be coerced, much like a girl in St. Mary Mead, who had once hidden a master's theft to keep her place. Leaving the tea shop, Miss Marple made her way to the churchyard, where the late afternoon light cast long shadows over the gravestones. She paused by the Carstairs family plot, where a fresh wreath marked Mrs. Carstairs' resting place beside her husband. The inscription on her stone read, Beloved wife, Eleanor, and Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the word beloved. A woman so cherished, she thought, might still have enemies, especially if her wealth or will was at stake. She recalled the pearl earring, caught in the curtain, and wondered if it had been torn off in a moment of haste or violence. As she stood there, the vicar, Mr. Clement, approached, his face etched with concern. Jane, you're deep in thought, he said. Have you found anything at Willow House? Miss Marple's smile was gentle. Only questions, Mr. Clement. But the village has been most illuminating. Mrs. Carstairs seems to have had her share of conflicts with her son, her doctor, even her nurse. The vicar nodded, his voice low. She was a strong woman, but not always easy. I heard she'd argued with Lionel about his debts just last week. And Clarewell, she was devoted, but devotion can wear thin. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. And Violet? Did she ever speak of her at the church? Mr. Clement hesitated. Only once. She said Violet was a good girl, but easily led. Mrs. Carstairs worried Clara was too hard on her. Miss Marple filed this away, her mind turning to the dynamics of the household. A maid under pressure, a son in debt, A doctor in need. A nurse with a temper reach was a thread, and the earring, the scuff, the mud were the knots that tied them together. As she walked back to her cottage, the village settling into the quiet of evening, Miss Marple's thoughts wove a pattern. The whispers of St. Mary Mead painted a picture of a household under strain, where loyalty was tested and secrets were kept. She thought of a case in the village years ago, where a butler's gossip had revealed a master's fraud, the truth hidden in casual words. The village, she murmured, always knows more than it says. With her knitting bag swinging gently at her side, Miss Marple resolved to return to Willow House, where the threads of gossip and evidence would soon, she was certain, form a clearer design. Chapter 8. The medical puzzle. Miss Jane Marple sat in her small parlor at St. Mary Mead, her knitting needles resting in her lap as she pondered the puzzle of Mrs. Eleanor Carstairs' death. The morning was quiet, save for the distant chime of the church bell, and her cottage was a haven of order-lace curtains, a ticking clock, and a pot of tea steaming gently on the table. Yet her mind was far from tranquil, weaving through the threads of evidence gathered at Willow House, the scuff on the window-sill, the pearl earring in the curtain, the smear of mud in the garden, and the whispered tensions of the village. Each was a piece of a larger pattern, and Miss Marple, with her keen eye for human nature, knew that the truth lay not in grand gestures but in the small, overlooked details. She had requested Dr. Morris Godwin's medical records and Clara Hen's nursing log, which Inspector Harrow had reluctantly sent to her cottage, along with a promise to have a chemist review the prescriptions. The documents now lay on her table, their pages worn but revealing. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles, her fingers tracing the entries as she compared the two sets of records. Clara's log, with its neat but irregular entries, showed doses of digitalis administered to Mrs. Carstairs, yet some dates were missing, and a page bore a jagged tear, as if torn in haste. Godwin's records, equally meticulous, listed prescriptions for digitalis, but several were not filled, and others showed doses higher than seemed prudent for a woman of Mrs. Carstairs' frailty. Miss Marple's lips pursed as she turned the pages. Digitalis, she knew from a St. Mary Mead case years ago, was a medicine as dangerous as it was beneficial. Too little could fail a weak heart. Too much could induce dizziness, confusion, or worse symptoms that might mask a deliberate act. She recalled old Mrs. Langley, whose collapse had been blamed on a heart condition until a chemist's analysis revealed an overdose, administered by a desperate heir. The parallel was striking, and Miss Marple's mind turned to Clara, whose strong hands and guarded demeanor suggested a woman capable of both care and concealment. She rose, her movements deliberate, and telephoned her friend, Mr. Hayworth, a retired chemist who lived in the next village. His voice crackled through the line, cheerful but curious. "Jane, what's this about? Another of your mysteries?" She smiled, explaining briefly about Mrs. Carstairs' death and the records. Could an overdose of digitalis mimic a natural death, Mr. Hayworth, or cause a fall? His reply was measured but firm. Indeed, it could. A high dose might cause dizziness, even fainting, especially in someone frail. And if death follows a fall, the heart failure could be mistaken for natural causes, especially if no autopsy is thorough. Miss Marple thanked him, her mind racing. The torn page in Clara's log suggested an attempt to hide something, perhaps a mistake in dosing, or something more sinister. She thought of the pearl earring caught in the curtain, and the scuff on the sill, both pointing to a moment of haste or struggle. Clara's muddy shoe, too, placed her in the garden near the roses, despite her claim of fetching herbs elsewhere. The pieces were aligning, and Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill of a pattern emerging, like a row of stitches falling into place. She returned to Willow House that afternoon, where Inspector Harrow awaited her in the drawing room. The air was heavy with the scent of beeswax and the weight of unanswered questions. Harrow, his mustache bristling with impatience, handed her a report from the chemist he'd consulted. Your friend was right, he said. The digitalis doses in Clara's log don't always match Godwin's prescriptions. Some were placebo sugar pills, essentially, while others were higher than prescribed. If Mrs. Carstairs got a placebo one day and a double dose the next, it could have made her unsteady. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed behind her spectacles. Unsteady enough to fall from a window. Harrow nodded, his skepticism softening. Possibly, but it's not proof of murder. Could be a mistake. Miss Marple's needles, which she had brought in her bag, clicked softly as she considered this. A mistake was plausible, but Clara's torn log and her presence in the garden suggested intent. She thought of Violet's fear, the maid's trembling hands when Clara's name was mentioned, and wondered if Clara had coerced Violet into silence about a dosing error, or something worse. Inspector, she said, her voice mild but firm. A placebo followed by an overdose could be accidental, but the torn page in the log is not. It suggests concealment, perhaps of negligence, perhaps of intent. She recalled the earring, its single pearl, a silent witness to a struggle. Mrs. Carstairs was a cautious woman, unlikely to lean out a window. But if she was dizzy, confused, and someone was there, someone strong, like Clara, push could look like a fall. Harrow rubbed his chin, his eyes narrowing. You're saying the nurse dosed her wrong on purpose? Miss Marple's smile was faint. I'm saying, Inspector, that people hide what they fear to lose. Clara's livelihood depended on her competence. If Mrs. Carstairs suspected negligence and threatened to report her, Clara had reason to act. She thought of a St. Mary Mead nurse who had once altered a patient's chart to hide a forgotten dose, only to be caught when a family member noticed the patient's decline. Clara's log, with its missing page, was a similar confession of fear. Harrow agreed to re-examine Clara's movements, and Miss Marple requested a closer look at the bedroom. They ascended the oak staircase, the house silent save for the creak of their steps. In Mrs. Carstairs' room, the window stood open, the autumn breeze stirring the chintz curtains. Miss Marple examined the sill again, the scuff mark still visible, its crescent shape matching Violet's worn shoe. But Clara's hands, she recalled, were strong enough to lift a frail woman, to push her through a low window in a moment of panic. The earring, she now believed, had been torn from Mrs. Carstairs' ear in a brief struggle, left behind when Clara fled the room. Back in the drawing room, Miss Marple sat with Harrow, her knitting untouched as she laid out her theory. Clara's log shows she gave placebos, perhaps to save money or cover a shortage. When Mrs. Carstairs noticed, she may have confronted her. An overdose followed, causing dizziness, and in a moment of fear, Clara pushed her, hoping it would look like an accident. Harrow's eyes widened, but he nodded. It fits, Miss Marple. The mud, the log, Violet's, ferrets, a pattern. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her voice soft. Patterns, Inspector, are what people leave behind when they try to hide the truth. Chapter 9. The Confrontation. Miss Jane Marple sat in the drawing room of Willow House, her knitting needles lying still in her lap, a rare pause that underscored the gravity of the moment. The room was bathed in the soft glow of late afternoon light, filtering through the heavy velvet drapes and casting long shadows across the polished floor. The portrait of Mrs. Eleanor Carstairs loomed above the mantel, her painted gaze seeming to demand answers as keenly as Miss Marple's own quiet scrutiny. Inspector Harrow stood by the fireplace, his broad hands clasped behind his back, his mustache twitching with a mix of anticipation and unease. The household: Clara Henshaw, Lionel Carstairs, Dr. Morris Godwin, and Violet Marsh had been summoned, and the air was thick with the tension of truths about to be unveiled. Miss Marple had spent the morning piecing together the threads of the case, the scuff on the windowsill, the pearl earring tangled in the curtain, the smear of mud in the garden, the discrepancies in Clara's medical log, and the whispers of St. Mary Mead that painted a household rife with hidden motives. Each clue, small and seemingly trivial, had woven a pattern in her mind, one that pointed inexorably to a single conclusion. She had shared her theory with Harrow, who, though initially skeptical, now stood ready to act on her insight. "Let's have it out, Miss Marple," he said, his voice low. "If you're right, we'll have our answer today." The suspects filed in, their faces a study in contrasts. Clara's stern composure, Lionel's forced charm, Godwin's polished reserve, and Violet's trembling timidity. They took their seats, the silence broken only by the faint creak of the chairs and the distant call of a blackbird outside. Miss Marple's eyes, mild but piercing, moved over each of them, noting the way Clara's hands tightened in her lap. Lionel's foot tapped restlessly, Godwin's fingers brushed his ink-stained cuff, and Violet's gaze flickered nervously toward Clara. The room, she thought, was like a tapestry stretched taut, ready to tear under the weight of truth. Harrow cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the stillness. "We've gathered you here because Mrs. Carstairs' death was no accident. She was pushed from her window, and one of you knows why." A ripple of unease passed through the group. Clara's lips thinned, Lionel's smile faltered, brow furrowed, and Violet let out a small gasp. Miss Marple spoke next, her voice as gentle as a summer breeze, but carrying an authority that silenced the room. "It's curious, isn't it, how small things betray us? A scuff on a sill, an earring left behind, a torn page in a log. These are not accidents, but signs of intent." She turned to Clara, her gaze steady. "Miss Henshaw, your log shows you gave Mrs. Carstairs placebos instead of digitalis on several occasions, and then, on the night she died, a dose far higher than prescribed. Why?" Clara's face paled, but her voice was defiant. "I followed Dr. Godwin's orders. If there's a mistake, it's his." Godwin stiffened, his voice sharp. "My prescriptions were clear." "You altered them, Clara." Miss Marple raised a hand, her tone calm but firm. "The torn page in your log, Miss Henshaw suggests you hid something. Perhaps Mrs. Carstairs noticed your negligence and threatened to report you. A nurse's career depends on trust, does it not?" Clara's hands clenched, but she said nothing, her silence louder than words. Miss Marple turned to Violet, her voice softening. "And you, Violet, were in that room, weren't you? The scuff on the sill matches your shoe, and your fear of Clara tells me you saw something you were told to forget." Violet's eyes filled with tears, her voice a whisper. I didn't mean to. She made me stay quiet." Clara's head snapped toward her, a flash of anger breaking her composure. "You little fool, hold your tongue." Harrow stepped forward, his voice stern. "Enough. Miss Henshaw, did you push Mrs. Carstairs to silence her accusations?" Clara's defiance wavered, her eyes darting to the door as if seeking escape. Miss Marple spoke again, her words deliberate. "The earring, Clara, was torn from Mrs. Carstairs' ear in a struggle. You were there, in her room, when she confronted you. Dizzy from an overdose, she was no match for your strength." Clara's shoulders sagged, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Lionel broke the silence, his voice sharp. "This is nonsense. I was in the library, nowhere near her room." Godwin nodded, his tone cool. "And I left at 8. Clara's the one who stayed." Miss Marple's eyes never left Clara's face. "Negligence, Miss Henshaw, is a heavy burden. You feared losing everything, your position, your reputation. So you acted, in a moment of panic, and pushed her." Clara's composure shattered, her voice a broken whisper. "She was going to ruin me. I only meant to frighten her, but she struggled, and it happened so fast." Harrow signaled to a constable, who stepped forward with handcuffs. "Clara Henshaw, you're under arrest for the murder of Eleanor Carstairs." As Clara was led away, her head bowed, the room exhaled. Lionel's face was ashen, Godwin's expression unreadable, and Violet sobbed quietly. her hands covering her face. Miss Marple folded her knitting, her heart heavy but her mind clear. Human nature, she said softly to Harrow, is a puzzle we solve too late. Chapter 10. The Confession. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in the drawing room of Willow House, her knitting needle still in her bag, a silent acknowledgement of the gravity of the moment. The air was heavy, the late afternoon light dimming as it filtered through the velvet drapes, casting a somber glow over the room. The portrait of Mrs. Eleanor Carstairs loomed above, its stern gaze softened by the shadows, as if the late matron herself bore witness to the unraveling of her death. Inspector Harrow stood by the door, his broad frame tense, his eyes fixed on Clara Henshaw, who sat alone now. The others, Lionel Carstairs, Dr. Morris Godwin, and Violet Marsh, having been dismissed to separate rooms to avoid further disruption. The constable stood ready, his handcuffs glinting in the muted light, a stark reminder of the justice about to be served. Clara's face was pale, her once stern composure fractured like a cracked mirror. Her hands, so capable and strong, now trembled in her lap, and her eyes, which had met every question with defiance, darted toward the floor, as if seeking refuge from Miss Marple's gentle but unrelenting gaze. The confrontation had shaken her, and the weight of her own words, it happened so fast, hung in the room like a confession yet to be fully spoken. Miss Marple, her voice soft but carrying the authority of truth, leaned forward slightly, her hands folded in a way that suggested both compassion and resolve. "Miss Henshaw," she said, her tone as calm as a summer afternoon, "you've carried a heavy burden, haven't you? To care for someone so closely, only to fear their judgment, it must have been unbearable." Clara's head jerked up, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and desperation. "I didn't mean it," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I never wanted her to die." Harrow's mustache twitched, but he remained silent, letting Miss Marple guide the moment, his earlier skepticism replaced by a grudging trust in her insight. Miss Marple's eyes, bright behind her spectacles, held Clara's gaze. "Tell us, Clara, what happened that night? Mrs. Carstairs suspected something, didn't she? About the placebos, the irregular doses." Clara's hands clenched, her knuckles white. She noticed she wasn't feeling right, she admitted, her voice barely audible. "She kept a diary, you see, of how she felt each day. She showed it to me that evening, said the medicine wasn't working, that she'd tell Dr. Godwin I'd been careless. I couldn't let her ruin me." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of understanding rather than judgment. She thought of a St. Mary Mead nurse who had once altered a patient's chart to hide a forgotten dose, her fear of exposure driving her to deceit. "So you gave her a stronger dose that night," Miss Marple said, hoping it would calm her, perhaps make her forget her suspicions. Clara's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded. "I thought just a little more digitalis would make her sleepy, quiet her complaints. But she got dizzy, started shouting, accusing me of stealing her medicine." Harrow leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "And then what, Miss Henshaw? You pushed her." Clara's sob broke the silence, her shoulders shaking. "She went to the window, said she needed air. She was unsteady, leaning on the sill. I panicked. She kept saying she'd report me, that I'd lose everything. I just wanted her to stop, to be quiet. I grabbed her arm, and she pulled away, and then her voice faltered, and she buried her face in her hands. I pushed her, but I didn't mean for her to fall. It was so quick." Miss Marple's heart was heavy, but her mind was clear. The scuff on the sill, the pearl earring torn from Mrs. Carstairs' ear in the struggle, the mud on Clara's shoe from her flight to the garden, all fit the confession like stitches in a completed row. "You ran out after," she said gently, "and left the earring behind, caught in the curtain." Clara nodded, her voice muffled. "I didn't realize. I just wanted to get away, to make it look like she fell." Harrow signaled to the constable, who stepped forward. "Clara Henshaw, you're under arrest for the murder of Eleanor Carstairs," he said, his tone formal but not unkind. As the handcuffs clicked around Clara's wrists, she looked at Miss Marple, her eyes pleading. "I didn't mean it," she repeated, but the words were hollow now, a plea drowned by the weight of her actions. Miss Marple's expression was kind but unyielding. Intent, Miss Henshaw, is not always in the act, but in the fear that drives it, she said softly. As Clara was led away, the drawing room fell silent, the air lighter but tinged with sorrow. Harrow turned to Miss Marple, his face a mix of admiration and exhaustion. "You saw it all, didn't you? The log, the mud, the earring, things I'd have missed." Miss Marple's smile was faint, her hands reaching for her knitting as if to steady herself. "People, Inspector, leave traces of their fears, their guilts. It's only a matter of seeing them clearly." She thought of the village, where every scandal, every secret, left its mark in whispers and glances, and knew that Clara's confession was but one thread in the tapestry of human frailty. Harrow gathered his notes, preparing to wrap up the case. But Miss Marple's mind lingered on the others: Lionel, whose debts remained a shadow; Godwin, whose errors were now exposed; Violet, whose fear had kept her silent. Each had played a part, however small, in the tensions that led to Mrs. Carstairs' death. "The truth," she murmured, her needles clicking once more, "is a heavy thing, but it sets the pattern right." As she rose to leave, the portrait of Mrs. Carstairs seemed to watch her, a silent acknowledgement that justice, however late, had been served. Chapter 11. The Aftermath. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cottage at St. Mary Mead, her knitting needles moving with their familiar, soothing rhythm as the evening light faded into dusk. The parlor was a haven of quiet, orderly curtains stirring faintly at the open window, a fire crackling in the hearth, and a tray of tea cooling on the table. Outside, the village settled into its nightly calm, but the echoes of Willow House lingered in Miss Marple's mind, the threads of the case now woven into a completed pattern. Clara Henshaw's confession had unraveled the mystery of Mrs. Eleanor Carstairs' death. Yet the aftermath, as Miss Marple knew, was often as telling as the crime itself. Human nature, she reflected, did not end with a confession, but rippled outward, touching all who had been entangled in the tragedy. Willow House, once a beacon of elegance, now stood subdued, its windows dark and its gardens silent. The village buzzed with the news of Clara's arrest, the whispers of St. Mary Mead carrying the story from the post office to the tea shop with the speed of autumn leaves on the wind. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, had heard the tales from her maid, Lily, who reported the village's shock and fascination. "They say Clara was always so proper," Lily said, her eyes wide. "Who'd have thought she'd do such a thing?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles clicking. "People, Lily, are rarely what they seem, especially when fear takes hold." Her thoughts turned to Lionel Carstairs, the son whose charm had masked a life of reckless debts. She had learned from Mr. Pettigrew, the solicitor, that Mrs. Carstairs required Lionel to settle his debts before inheriting her estate, a condition that now weighed heavily on him. Miss Marple had met him briefly at the church, where he attended a memorial for his mother, his face pale and his cufflinks conspicuously absent. "I've been a fool," he had said to her, his voice low, "but I'll make it right." Miss Marple had nodded, her eyes kind but discerning. She recalled a St. Mary Mead youth who had squandered his family's savings only to reform when faced with loss. Lionel, she hoped, might find a similar path, though the shadow of his mother's death would linger. Dr. Morris Godwin, too, had felt the ripple of Clara's confession. His medical records, exposed as inconsistent, had drawn scrutiny from the local medical board, and village gossip suggested his practice was faltering further. Miss Marple had seen him in the high street, his silver hair less polished, his shoulders stooped under the weight of whispers. A doctor's mistakes, she murmured to herself, are not easily forgiven. She thought of a St. Mary Mead, the physician who had retired after a patient's complaint, his pride more wounded than his purse. Godwin, she suspected, would need to rebuild his reputation elsewhere, for St. Mary Mead was not kind to those who betrayed its trust. Violet Marsh, the timid maid, had found a new position in a neighboring village, her fear of Clara now a memory. Miss Marple had spoken to her at the vicarage, where Violet's eyes were brighter, her hands steadier. "I'm sorry I didn't speak sooner, miss," she had said, her voice soft but clear. "I was so afraid of her." Miss Marple had patted her hand, her smile warm. "Fear, Violet, is a heavy chain, but you've broken it now." She thought of a St. Mary Mead girl who had once kept silent about a theft, her courage growing only when the truth was safe to tell. Violet, she believed, would thrive away from Willow House's shadows. The village itself seemed to exhale, its rhythm restored now that justice had been served. Yet Miss Marple knew that St. Mary Mead would never quite forget the tragedy of Willow House. The rose bushes, the low window, the pearl earring, these would become part of its lore, whispered over tea and knitting. She thought of the scuff on the sill, the torn page in Clara's log, and the mud that had betrayed a nurse's panic. Each had been a thread, and together they had formed a tapestry of motive and fear, as clear to her as the stitches in her knitting dot. As she set her needles aside, Miss Marple rose to tend her garden, where the last of the autumn roses bloomed. The case was closed, but her mind, ever restless, turned to the next puzzle that St. Mary Mead might offer. "Human nature," she said softly, clipping a wilted bloom, "is the greatest mystery of all." With a final glance at the darkening sky, she returned to her parlor, ready for whatever secrets the village might next reveal. Chapter 12. The quiet reflection. Miss Jane Marple sat in her small garden at St. Mary Mead, her hands busy with the delicate task of pruning her roses, their late blooms glowing softly in the twilight. The air was cool, scented with earth and the faint sweetness of the flowers, and the village beyond her cottage was hushed. Its daily bustle settled into the gentle rhythm of evening. Her knitting lay indoors, a rare absence, for in this moment Miss Marple's thoughts were her needles, weaving the final threads of the Willow House tragedy into a pattern now complete. The confession of Clara Henshaw had brought justice, yet the aftermath lingered in her mind, a reminder that truth, once uncovered, left its own quiet ripples. She paused, her secateurs poised over a wilted petal, and gazed across the garden, where the fading light cast long shadows. Willow House, though out of sight, loomed large in her thoughts, its ivy-clad walls, its low window, the rose bushes that had cradled Mrs. Eleanor Carstairs' final moments. The case had been one of small details, each a stitch in the fabric of deceit: the scuff on the sill, the pearl earring, the smear of mud, the torn page in Clara's log. Miss Marple had seen such patterns before, in the scandals and secrets of St. Mary Mead, where human frailty was as common as the roses she tended. Her mind turned to Clara, now awaiting trial, her stern facade broken by the weight of her own fear. Miss Marple felt no triumph in her exposure, only a quiet sorrow for a woman driven to desperation by the threat of ruin. She recalled a St. Mary Mead widow who had once hidden a theft to protect her name, her shame unraveling in much the same way. Clara's push, impulsive and panicked, was a moment of weakness, not malice, but the result was the same: a life lost, a household fractured. Lionel Carstairs, too, occupied her thoughts. His promise to settle his debts, made in the shadow of his mother's memorial, was a fragile hope. But Miss Marple saw potential in his chastened demeanor. She thought of a village lad who had turned from gambling to honest work after a family loss, and hoped Lionel might find a similar resolve. Dr. Maurice Godwin, his practice now under scrutiny, would likely leave St. Mary Mead, his polished air tarnished by the village's unforgiving memory. And Violet Marsh, freed from Clara's shadow, had a chance to bloom. Much like the roses Miss Marple now tended, the village itself had resumed its rhythm, but the story of Willow House would linger, woven into its gossip like a cautionary tale. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her fingers brushing a rose's soft petals. She knew St. Mary Mead would always have its secrets, its small betrayals and hidden fears, and she would always be there, watching, listening, piecing together the patterns that others overlooked. People, she murmured, are like my roses, beautiful, but full of thorns. As she gathered her tools and turned toward her cottage, the first stars appeared in the deepening sky. The case was closed, the truth revealed, but Miss Marple's mind was never truly at rest. There would be other mysteries, other threads to unravel, and she would be ready. Her quiet reflection sharpening her for the next puzzle St. Mary Mead might offer. With a final glance at her garden, she stepped inside, the door closing softly behind her, leaving the roses to whisper their own secrets to the night.